The snow was falling softly outside the window of Betty's Diner, a small place tucked away on the corner of 5th and Main. Inside, the warmth from the old radiators fought against the December cold, and the smell of coffee and apple pie filled the air. It was Christmas Eve around 9 in the evening, and the place was almost empty. Robert Hartford sat alone in a booth near the back. At 58 years old, he'd made more money than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes. His tech company had changed the way the world communicated, and his name appeared on Forbes lists every year. Tonight he wore an expensive suit under a cashmere coat, but he'd loosened his tie and looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. An hour earlier, he'd been at his company's annual Christmas party. The ballroom had been decorated with thousands of white lights and crystal ornaments. There was champagne, a live orchestra, and 200 employees and executives laughing and making toasts. But Robert had felt completely alone in that crowd of people. Everyone wanted something from him. A promotion, his attention, his approval. Nobody really saw him as a person anymore. They saw a wallet, a boss, a stepping stone to their own success. So he'd slipped out the side door without telling anyone and started driving. He didn't have a destination in mind. He just needed to be somewhere real, somewhere without the fake smiles and calculated conversations. That's how he ended up at Betty's Diner, a place he'd never been before in a neighborhood far from his penthouse apartment. The diner had seen better days. The red vinyl on the booth seats was cracked and patched with tape. The Christmas decorations were the kind you'd find at a dollar store. Paper snowflakes taped to the windows and a small plastic tree on the counter with lights that blinked in an uneven rhythm. But there was something honest about it. Something that felt more like Christmas than the expensive party he'd just left. A young woman approached his table with a coffee pot in her hand. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come slightly loose during her shift. Her uniform was a simple blue dress with a white apron, both clean but faded from many washings. Her name tag read Katie in slightly crooked letters. "Coffee?" she asked, and her smile was genuine. Not the kind of smile people gave him at parties when they wanted something. Just a regular friendly smile from someone doing her job. "Please," Robert said, pushing his cup toward her. She poured carefully, not spilling a drop, and he noticed her hands. They were red and rough, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. She wore no jewelry except for a small silver chain around her neck with a tiny heart-shaped locket. "Can I get you anything to eat?" "The apple pie is really good tonight. Helen made it fresh this afternoon. Just the coffee is fine, thank you." She nodded and started to walk away, but something made Robert speak again. "Slow night?" Katie turned back with a slight laugh. "Yeah, most people are home with their families. We'll close in about an hour." She glanced around the nearly empty diner. An elderly man sat at the counter reading a newspaper, and a young couple shared a milkshake in a booth near the door. "But that's okay. Gives me time to think." There was something in the way she said it, a hint of sadness behind her pleasant expression, that caught Robert's attention. In his world, people hid their feelings behind professional masks, but this young waitress seemed almost transparent in her honesty. "I hope you're thinking about happy things," he said, surprising himself with the personal comment. Katie's smile faltered for just a second. "Trying to," she said softly. Then she seemed to catch herself. "Can I warm that up for you in a bit?" "Sure, thank you, Katie." She seemed surprised that he'd used her name, glancing down at her name tag as if she'd forgotten she was wearing it. Then she smiled again and walked back toward the kitchen. Robert sat there for a while, watching the snow fall outside and listening to the quiet sounds of the diner. The old cash register dinging, the cook whistling in the kitchen, the soft music playing from a radio somewhere in the back. It was peaceful in a way his life hadn't been for years. He thought about his own children. David was 32 now, living in London, working as an investment banker. They talked maybe 3 times a year, always awkward conversations that felt more like business meetings than father-son chats. His daughter Rachel was 29, married to a lawyer living in California. She'd invited him to Christmas dinner tomorrow, but it had felt like an obligation rather than a real invitation. He'd made an excuse about having to work. The truth was, Robert had spent so many years building his empire that he'd forgotten to build relationships with the people who mattered. His wife had died 5 years ago. and he still regretted all the dinners he'd missed, all the anniversaries he'd been too busy for. She'd loved Christmas. She'd always wanted to volunteer at soup kitchens and homeless shelters during the holidays, but he'd always been too busy with company parties and business dinners. Katie came back after 20 minutes, refreshing his coffee without him having to ask. This time she seemed less rushed. The elderly man had left and the young couple was putting on their coats. "You don't seem like our usual crowd," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just curiosity. Robert smiled. "I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere real." "Well, you found it. This place has been here for 40 years. My friend's grandmother owns it." Katie wiped down the table next to his, even though it was already clean. She seemed like someone who needed to keep her hands busy. "Do you work here every Christmas Eve?" Robert asked. "Last few years, yeah. The tips are usually good and I need the money." She said it matter-of-factly, without shame or self-pity, just stating a simple truth. Robert found himself genuinely curious about this young woman. In his world, everyone was either trying to impress him or get something from him. But Katie seemed completely unaware of who he was, treating him like any other customer. It was refreshing. "Can I ask you something?" The words came out before he'd really thought about them. Katie looked at him a bit surprised. "Sure, I guess. If you could have anything for Christmas, anything at all, what would it be?" It was an odd question, he knew that. The kind of question a stranger shouldn't really ask. But something about this night, this place, this moment made him want to know. He was tired of shallow conversations. He wanted to hear something real. Katie's expression changed. Her pleasant waitress smile faded, and for a moment her eyes glistened with something that looked like tears. She caught herself quickly, blinking and looking away. "That's a big question," she said quietly. "I know. I'm sorry if it's too personal." "No, it's just—" She trailed off, then took a breath. "Can I think about it? I need to finish closing up, but if you're still here in a bit, maybe I'll have an answer." "I'll be here," Robert said. Katie nodded and walked away, and Robert noticed that her steps were a bit slower now, as if his question had made her remember something heavy. He wondered if he'd made a mistake by asking, if he'd ruined her evening by bringing up something painful. But he also felt more awake than he had in months. For the first time in years, he was having a real conversation with someone. Not about stock prices or business strategies or the next big tech trend. Just a simple human question, and he genuinely wanted to know her answer. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Robert waited, sipping his coffee, watching Katie move through the diner, turning off lights and wiping down tables. He didn't know it yet, but this conversation was about to change everything he thought he knew about wealth, happiness, and what really mattered in life. Robert sat in the booth for another hour, watching Katie work. She moved with practiced efficiency, wiping down the counter, refilling salt and pepper shakers, rolling silverware into napkins for the next day. The cook, a heavy-set man with gray hair, poked his head out from the kitchen and said goodnight. The last customers left around 10, and Katie flipped the sign on the door to closed. She disappeared into the back for a few minutes, and Robert wondered if she'd forgotten about him. Maybe she'd decided his question was too strange and was hoping he'd just leave. He wouldn't blame her. It had been an odd thing to ask a stranger. But then she emerged from the back room, her apron removed, wearing a worn winter coat over her uniform. She was carrying 2 cups of tea and walked toward his booth with a look of determination mixed with nervousness. "I made us some tea," she said. "I hope you don't mind. I thought about your question and I have an answer, but it's not an easy one to give." "Please sit down," Robert said, surprised and touched that she'd come back. Katie slid into the booth across from him, wrapping her hands around her cup of tea like she needed its warmth. Up close, Robert could see the tiredness in her face, the kind that came from more than just a long shift. It was the exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a very long time. For a moment, they both sat in silence. The diner was completely quiet now, except for the hum of the refrigerators in the back and the occasional sound of cars passing on the snowy street outside. "I don't usually talk about this with strangers," Katie began, her voice soft. "Actually, I don't really talk about it with anyone. But your question, it made me realize that I've been holding this inside for so long that maybe it would help to say it out loud." Robert nodded, not wanting to interrupt, sensing that this was important. Katie took a sip of her tea, her hands trembling slightly. If I could have anything for Christmas, anything in the whole world, I would want one more conversation with my sister. Just one more. That's all. The way she said it with such quiet desperation made Robert's chest tighten. He waited for her to continue. Her name was Beth. She was 16 when she died 8 months ago. Leukemia. Katie's voice cracked on that last word, but she kept going. She was my little sister, but honestly, she was everything to me. She was my whole world. Robert felt his own eyes beginning to water. He'd asked a simple question, expecting maybe to hear about wanting a car or money or a vacation. He hadn't expected this raw, honest pain. Our parents died 6 years ago in a car accident, Katie continued, staring into her tea. I was 19, Beth was 10. We didn't have any other family, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles who could take us in. I had just started community college, but I dropped out to take care of her. Got 3 jobs to keep us afloat. We made it work. It was hard, but we were happy. We had each other. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Then 3 years ago, Beth started getting sick. At first, the doctors thought it was just the flu, but it kept getting worse. When they finally diagnosed the leukemia, they said it was aggressive. Stage 3. She needed immediate treatment. Robert listened, his heart breaking with every word. In his world of boardrooms and stock options, he'd forgotten that real people dealt with real tragedies every single day. The next 2.5 years were a blur, Katie said. Hospital visits, chemotherapy, radiation, experimental treatments. Beth was so brave through all of it. She never complained, not once. She'd be throwing up from the chemo, losing her hair, too weak to stand, and she'd still smile and tell me everything was going to be okay. She was the sick one, but she was comforting me. Katie's voice grew quieter. I worked constantly to pay for everything. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. I took extra shifts wherever I could. Cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves at grocery stores, and working here during the day. Sometimes I'd work 20 hours straight, go see Beth at the hospital for an hour, then go back to work. That's incredible, Robert said softly. What you did for her. Katie shook her head. It wasn't incredible. It's what anyone would do for someone they love. Beth was funny and smart and talented. She wanted to be an artist. Even when she was sick, she'd sketch things in her hospital room. Nurses, doctors, other patients, the view from her window. She made that hospital feel less scary for everyone around her. Robert could picture it, a brave young girl facing death but still finding beauty in the world around her. Toward the end, the doctors said there wasn't much more they could do, Katie continued, her voice breaking. The cancer had spread. They gave her maybe a few weeks. Beth knew it too. She was scared, but she tried to hide it from me. We'd lie in her hospital bed and talk about everything, our favorite memories, what we thought heaven might be like, what she wanted me to do with my life after she was gone. Tears were streaming down Katie's face now, and Robert felt his own eyes burning. That last week, I barely left her side. But I had to work, you know? The bills didn't stop. The hospital bills, the rent, the basic costs of living. I'd gotten so far behind on everything. So on her last night, I went to do a cleaning job at an office building. It was supposed to be quick, just 3 hours. I needed the money. $50. That's what the job paid. $50. Katie's hands were shaking so badly now that tea was sloshing out of her cup onto the table. She didn't seem to notice. Beth had been stable all day. The nurses said I should go, that I needed to take care of myself too. So I went to work. I was planning to come back around midnight, but I was so tired. I'd been awake for almost 40 hours straight. And when I got back to the hospital at 11:30, the nurses met me in the hallway. Their faces told me everything. Beth had passed away 20 minutes earlier. The sob that came out of Katie was heartbreaking. Robert reached across the table and took her hand, not knowing what else to do. 20 minutes, Katie whispered. If I had just left work 20 minutes earlier. If I hadn't taken that stupid job. I missed her last moments because of $50. I fell asleep at her bedside so many times before, exhausted from working, and she always understood. But the one night that mattered most, I wasn't there. She died alone. Katie, I'm so sorry, Robert said, and the words felt completely inadequate. The nurses told me it was peaceful. They said she just fell asleep. But I'll never know for sure. I'll never know if she was scared at the end, if she called out for me, if she wanted to say something important. That's my biggest regret. Not money, not the things I gave up, not the debt I'm still buried under. Just that I didn't get to be there for her final breath. I didn't get to tell her one more time how much I loved her, how proud I was of her courage, how she made my life worth living. The silence that followed was heavy with grief. Robert sat there, holding the hand of this young woman he'd just met, feeling utterly shattered by her story. All his wealth, all his power, all his success meant nothing in the face of this kind of loss and love. "So that's my answer to your question," Katie said, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were red and swollen, but there was also something relieved in her expression, as if saying it all out loud had lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying. "If I could have anything for Christmas, I'd want one more conversation with Beth. I'd tell her that I'm sorry for not being there at the end. I'd tell her about the sunset I saw last week that was her favorite color of orange. I'd tell her that I still sleep with her favorite sweater because it used to smell like her. I'd tell her that I'm trying to be okay, even though most days I'm not. I just want to hear her voice one more time, hear her laugh, hear her tell me everything's going to be all right the way she always did." Robert couldn't speak. His throat was tight with emotion. This young woman, this waitress who served coffee and cleared tables, had loved more deeply and sacrificed more completely than anyone he'd ever known in his wealthy circles. She'd given everything for her sister and still felt like it wasn't enough. "I'm sorry," Katie said, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "I shouldn't have dumped all of this on you." "You're probably sorry you asked." "No," Robert said firmly, finding his voice. "Don't apologize. I asked because I wanted to know. And I'm honored that you trusted me with this." Katie managed a small smile. It felt good to talk about her. "Most people don't ask. They get uncomfortable when I mention Beth, so I've learned to just keep it to myself. But you asked what I wanted for Christmas, and that's the truth. The only truth. I don't want money or a new car or a vacation. I just want my sister back, and since I can't have that, I'd settle for one more conversation." They sat together for a while longer, neither of them speaking. Robert thought about his own life, his own children who were still alive but felt like strangers. He'd taken so much for granted. Time, presence, the simple gift of being there. When Katie finally stood up to leave, Robert did too. He wanted to give her money to help somehow, but he sensed that would be the wrong thing to do. This wasn't about money. It never had been. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said. "Your sister was lucky to have you." "I was the lucky one," Katie replied. "Beth taught me what really matters in life. Love, being there for people, making every moment count. I just wish I'd known our time together would be so short. I'd have done everything differently." She pulled on her gloves and picked up her purse. "Merry Christmas," she said, and there was a genuine warmth in her words despite the sadness in her eyes. "Merry Christmas, Katie." He watched her walk out into the snowy night, and something inside him shifted. He'd asked a simple question, expecting a simple answer. Instead, he'd been given a gift he didn't deserve, a glimpse into real love, real sacrifice, real loss. And he knew, standing there in that empty diner, that he would never forget this conversation for as long as he lived. Robert couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his king-sized bed in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Katie and her sister. The snow had stopped falling, and the city lights filtered through his floor-to-ceiling windows, casting strange shadows across the room. But all he could see was the pain in Katie's eyes when she talked about missing those final 20 minutes. Christmas morning came and went. He ignored the few phone calls he received, the automated holiday messages from business associates, the awkward text from his daughter asking if he was sure he didn't want to fly out to California. He sat in his home office, supposedly reviewing quarterly reports, but his mind kept wandering back to that diner. By December 26th, he'd made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia who'd worked for him for 15 years. "Patricia, I need you to find someone for me." Discreetly. "Of course, Mr. Hartford. Who are we looking for?" "A young woman named Katie. She works as a waitress at a place called Betty's Diner on 5th and Main. I need to know everything about her situation. But this needs to be handled with absolute sensitivity. I don't want her to know anyone's asking about her." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Patricia was used to unusual requests, but this one clearly caught her off guard. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "Personal curiosity," Robert said. "But Patricia, I mean it. Complete discretion. Use someone outside our usual channels. I want facts, not speculation, and I want to know the full picture of her circumstances." "Understood," I'll have someone on it today. 3 days later, Patricia called him back. Mr. Hartford, I have the information you requested. I'm sending over a full report, but I wanted to give you a heads up first. This young woman, the situation is quite difficult. Tell me. Patricia's voice softened, something Robert rarely heard from his normally businesslike assistant. Her full name is Catherine Ann Chen. She's 24 years old. She works 3 jobs, the diner being just one of them. She stocks shelves at a grocery store 3 nights a week and does freelance graphic design work when she can find clients, usually late at night. Robert listened, already feeling a heaviness in his chest. She lives in a studio apartment in a building that should probably be condemned. The landlord is apparently not great about repairs. According to our investigator, there's a leak in her ceiling that's been there for months and the heating barely works, but she's never late on rent. Go on. The medical bills from her sister's treatment are extensive. Over $200,000. She's been making minimum payments every month, never missing one. But at the rate she's going, it'll take her 30 years to pay it off. The interest alone is crippling. Robert closed his eyes. $200,000. To him, that was nothing. Less than nothing. He'd spend more than that on a single business dinner for clients. But to Katie, it was a life sentence of debt. There's more, Patricia continued. I did some digging into her background. 7 years ago, she was accepted to the Rhode Island School of Design, full scholarship. She was apparently quite talented as an artist. But she deferred enrollment to take care of her sister after their parents died, and eventually she lost the spot. Robert felt anger rising in his chest, though he wasn't sure who he was angry at. The unfairness of it all, the fact that someone so young had to sacrifice so much. What else? She had to sell nearly everything of value to pay for her sister's treatments. Family jewelry, her father's guitar collection, which was apparently quite valuable, vintage instruments. She got about $40,000 for them, which went straight to the hospital. Our investigator spoke with some of her neighbors and former co-workers. Everyone says the same thing. She's kind, hardworking, never complains. Never asks for help, Robert rubbed his temples. What about the night her sister died? Can you find out more about that? There was a rustling of papers. According to hospital records, which we obtained through legal channels, Beth Chen passed away at 11:07 p.m. on April 14th. Catherine had left the hospital at 8 p.m. to go to a cleaning job at an office complex downtown. The job paid $50. She returned to the hospital at 11:30, 23 minutes after her sister had passed. 23 minutes. Robert felt sick. For $50, this young woman had missed the most important 23 minutes of her life. The nurses noted in their report that Beth had been stable all evening. There was no indication that she was declining rapidly. Catherine had been at the hospital for almost 60 hours straight before that. The nurses actually encouraged her to go, to take care of herself. No one expected Beth to pass when she did. So it wasn't her fault, Robert said quietly. Not remotely. But according to a social worker who spoke with her afterward, Catherine believes it was. She carries tremendous guilt about it. Robert stood up and walked to his window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Katie was probably working one of her 3 jobs, still paying off those impossible debts, still carrying the weight of a guilt she didn't deserve. Is there anything else? Yes, one more thing that I think you'll want to know. Catherine volunteers at the hospital where her sister was treated. Every Sunday morning, she goes to the pediatric cancer ward and spends 3 hours reading to the children. She also brings art supplies when she can afford them, and does art projects with the kids. The staff says the children love her. She never talks about her own loss. She just shows up every week and gives these kids her time and attention. Robert had to sit down. This woman, who had every reason to be bitter, angry, broken, was spending her only day off volunteering with sick children, giving to others what she could no longer give her sister. Thank you, Patricia. Send me the full report. Mr. Hartford, if you don't mind me asking, what are you planning to do with this information? I'm not sure yet, but something needs to be done. Over the next few days, Robert couldn't focus on anything else. He attended meetings but didn't hear what people were saying. He reviewed contracts but couldn't concentrate on the words. All he could think about was Katie and the crushing unfairness of her situation. He thought about his own life, the money he wasted on things that didn't matter, the $20,000 watch he'd bought last month and worn twice, the luxury car collection in his garage that he never drove, the vacation home in Aspen he visited once a year. Meanwhile, Katie was working herself to exhaustion, just to make minimum payments on debt she'd accumulated trying to save her sister's life. But Robert knew enough about people to understand that Katie wouldn't accept charity. She had pride, dignity, the kind of person who made every rent payment on time despite living in a building with a leaking roof, wasn't the kind of person who would take a handout from a stranger. No matter how well-intentioned, he needed to help her, but he needed to do it in a way that wouldn't wound her pride or make her feel like a charity case. It had to be done carefully, thoughtfully. Robert spent another week researching and planning. He met with lawyers, accountants, and foundation directors. He asked questions, explored options, and slowly began to formulate a plan, a way to help Katie without making her feel helpless. During this time, he learned even more details that broke his heart. Katie had been an honor student in high school. She'd won several art competitions. Her teachers had written glowing recommendations for her college applications, describing her as one of the most talented students they'd ever taught. She'd had a future full of possibility. Then her parents died, and she'd stepped up to raise her 10-year-old sister. No hesitation, no resentment, just pure selfless love. She'd put her own dreams on hold to give her sister a chance at life. And even though Beth had ultimately lost her battle with cancer, Katie had given her 6 good years. 6 years of love, stability, and hope. The more Robert learned, the more he realized how small his own problems were. He'd spent decades chasing success, building his company, accumulating wealth. But he'd never really sacrificed anything. He'd never put someone else's needs completely before his own. He'd never loved anyone the way Katie had loved her sister. One detail from the investigator's report particularly struck him. A neighbor had mentioned that on Beth's last birthday, which was about a month before she died, Katie had saved up for weeks to buy her a professional set of art supplies. Pencils, paints, brushes, sketchbooks, the works. It had cost over $300, money Katie desperately needed for other things. But she'd wanted Beth to have something special, something that would bring her joy. Beth had been too weak by then to do much drawing, but according to the neighbor, she'd cried with happiness. She'd told Katie it was the best gift she'd ever received. And in those final weeks when she had energy, she'd used those supplies to create small sketches that she'd given to the nurses and other patients, little gifts of beauty in a place surrounded by sickness and fear. Robert found himself crying while reading that part of the report. Sitting in his expensive office chair, wearing a suit that cost more than Katie probably made in a month, he cried for this young woman he'd met only once. Cried for her loss, her sacrifice, her bottomless capacity for love, and he made himself a promise. He was going to help her, not to make himself feel better, not to ease his own guilt about the disparity between their lives, but because it was the right thing to do, because someone who had given so much deserved to receive something in return, because the universe owed Katie Chen a break and he was in a position to provide it, but he had to be smart about it, had to be careful, had to make sure that his help didn't hurt her pride or make her feel indebted. This wasn't about him. It was about giving Katie a chance to breathe, to heal, to maybe even dream again about the future she'd set aside. Robert opened a new document on his computer and began to type. He was a businessman, a strategist. He knew how to solve complex problems, and he was going to solve this one, no matter how long it took or how complicated it became, because for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond making his next $1 billion. He felt like he could do something that actually mattered, something that would help a real person in a real way. And maybe, just maybe, helping Katie would help him too. Help him understand what it meant to use his wealth for something more than just accumulating more wealth. Help him remember that behind every financial transaction, every business deal, the very number on a spreadsheet, there were real people with real lives and real struggles. Katie had asked for the impossible that night in the diner. She'd asked for one more conversation with her sister. Robert couldn't give her that, but he could give her something else. He could give her a chance to live again instead of just surviving. And he was going to do exactly that. Robert spent the next 2 weeks putting together his plan with the precision he usually reserved for major business deals. But this was different. This wasn't about profit margins or market share. This was about changing someone's life without destroying their dignity in the process. His first step was establishing something that looked completely legitimate. He worked with his lawyers to create a medical debt forgiveness program through an existing healthcare foundation. The foundation was real, well-established, and had been doing good work for years. Robert made a significant anonymous donation to fund this new program, ensuring it had enough money to help not just Katie, but dozens of other people in similar situations. The program had specific criteria. Recipients had to have accumulated medical debt through caring for a family member with a terminal illness. They had to have demonstrated consistent payment efforts. They had to have no history of fraud or misrepresentation, and they had to be randomly selected from a pool of qualifying candidates. Of course, Robert made sure Katie qualified, but he also made sure 20 other people qualified too. People in genuinely desperate situations who could use the help. He wasn't just creating a fake program to help one person. He was creating something real that would do actual good in the world. It felt right. In mid-January, Katie received a letter at her apartment. Robert knew this because he'd asked Patricia to discreetly monitor the situation, not by invading Katie's privacy, but by staying in touch with the foundation's directors. The letter informed her that she'd been selected as a recipient of the Medical Debt Forgiveness Initiative. Her entire debt, all $207,000 of it, had been forgiven. She owed nothing. The letter included documentation, contact information for the foundation, and explanations of the tax implications. It was professional, official, and completely legitimate. According to Patricia, who heard it from the foundation director, Katie had called the number on the letter 3 times before she believed it was real. She'd been convinced it was a scam, but after speaking with the foundation's representatives, after having them verify her information and explain the program in detail, she'd finally accepted that it was true. The director told Patricia that Katie had cried on the phone. Not just a few tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs of relief. She'd been carrying that debt like a physical weight for so long that having it lifted all at once had overwhelmed her. But Robert didn't stop there. He knew that forgiving the debt was just the beginning. Katie still lived in a terrible apartment, still worked 3 jobs, still had very little margin for error in her life. He needed to do more, but again, he needed to do it carefully. Through different channels, different organizations, he began to implement the rest of his plan. He donated to a nonprofit housing organization that did repairs for low-income tenants. He made sure Katie's building was selected for their next renovation project. Within a month, her apartment had been repaired. New roof, new heating system, fresh paint, even new appliances. The landlord received a grant that covered all the costs, so there was no reason to raise the rent. Robert arranged for an anonymous scholarship fund to be established in Beth's name through a legitimate memorial foundation. The scholarship was specifically for young adults who had sacrificed their own education to care for sick family members. Katie was informed that she was the first recipient. The scholarship would cover tuition, books, and supplies for her to pursue an art degree online while continuing to work. She could go at her own pace, no pressure, no strings attached. The hardest part was arranging something personal without revealing himself. Robert wanted Katie to have something that honored Beth's memory. Through the hospital's social services department, he arranged for a commissioned portrait of Beth. He told them it was a gift from the hospital's memorial fund, something they occasionally did for families of pediatric patients who had left a lasting impact on the staff. He hired a talented artist, provided them with photos that the hospital had on file from Beth's time there, and waited. When the portrait was finished, it was beautiful. Beth was shown smiling, holding a paintbrush surrounded by flowers. It captured her spirit, her courage, her light. The hospital presented it to Katie in February, along with a letter supposedly from the nurses who had cared for Beth. The letter explained that Beth had touched so many lives during her time on the ward, and they wanted her memory to be honored in a special way. Patricia reported that Katie had hung the portrait in her apartment and often sat in front of it in the evenings, just looking at her sister's face, talking to her like she was still there. Robert felt his throat tighten when he heard that. He'd managed to give her a small piece of what she'd asked for that night in the diner. Not a real conversation with Beth, but a beautiful reminder of her sister's spirit. Over the following months, Robert continued to quietly arrange things. He made sure the grocery store where Katie worked got a grant that allowed them to increase employee wages. It wasn't just for Katie, but for all the workers, which made it seem like a normal business decision, rather than charity. Katie's hourly wage went up by $3, which meant she could cut back on some of her freelance hours and actually sleep more than 5 hours a night. He also arranged for her volunteer work at the hospital to be recognized. The hospital received a donation that allowed them to create a small volunteer appreciation fund that provided gift cards and small bonuses to regular volunteers. Katie received a $500 gift card to an art supply store, along with a certificate thanking her for her hundreds of hours of service to pediatric patients. Through it all, Robert was careful never to do too much at once, never to make it obvious that someone was specifically helping Katie. Everything he did was filtered through legitimate organizations, foundations, and programs. Everything had a paper trail that made sense. Everything could be explained as fortunate timing or coincidence. But Robert knew the truth. He was systematically removing the obstacles from Katie's life, giving her room to breathe, space to heal, opportunity to dream again. And he was doing it anonymously because he didn't want her gratitude. He didn't want her to feel obligated to him. He just wanted her to have a chance at happiness. As winter turned to spring, Robert found himself checking in on Katie's progress more and more. Not in a creepy way, he told himself. He wasn't stalking her or invading her privacy. He was simply staying informed through the various organizations he'd worked with, making sure his plan was actually helping, not hurting, and from what he could tell, it was working. Katie had enrolled in 2 online art classes. She'd cut down from 3 jobs to 2, which meant she actually had free time for the first time in years. She'd started a small online portfolio of her work, selling prints and taking commissions. Nothing that made her rich, but something that fed her soul in a way that waiting tables never could. The reports Patricia gave him painted a picture of a young woman slowly coming back to life. Katie smiled more, according to the diner's owner, who Patricia had befriended. She'd started going out occasionally with coworkers, something she'd never had time for before. She still volunteered at the hospital every Sunday, but now she came with better art supplies and more energy to give to the children. Robert found himself feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Not pride exactly, though he supposed there was some of that. More like purpose. For decades he'd been making money, building companies, creating shareholder value. All important things, sure, but they'd never made him feel the way this did. Actually changing someone's life for the better. Actually making a real difference for a real person. But as the months passed, Robert also felt a growing emptiness. He'd helped Katie from a distance, but he missed talking to her. That one conversation in the diner had been more real, more meaningful than thousands of business meetings and social events. He found himself wanting to check on her in person, to see how she was doing, to maybe even continue the conversation they'd started that Christmas Eve. He struggled with this desire. On one hand, he'd worked so hard to help her anonymously, to keep himself out of it. On the other hand, he genuinely wanted to know her, to hear her thoughts, to maybe even become her friend. Not because of what he'd done for her, but because of who she was. By summer, Robert made a decision. He would go back to the diner, not to reveal what he'd done, not to expect gratitude or recognition, but simply to have coffee and maybe talk to her again. If she was working, if she remembered him. If the moment felt right, he told himself it was innocent enough. He was just a customer, after all. Someone who'd had a meaningful conversation with a waitress 6 months ago. There was nothing weird about stopping by to see how she was doing. People did that all the time, right? But deep down, Robert knew it was more complicated than that. He knew things about Katie's life that he shouldn't know. He'd been pulling strings behind, and the scenes, changing her circumstances without her knowledge. There was a dishonesty to it, even if his intentions had been good. Still, the desire to see her again outweighed his concerns. He missed the authenticity of their conversation, the realness of her grief and hope. In a life full of shallow interactions and calculated relationships, that one honest conversation had reminded him of what it felt like to actually connect with another human being. So on a warm Tuesday evening in July, Robert drove back to Betty's diner. His heart was pounding in a way that felt ridiculous for a man his age. He was nervous, actually nervous, about seeing a young waitress he'd met once, but he couldn't help it. As he pushed open the door, the bell chimed and he saw her. Katie was wiping down a table, wearing the same faded uniform, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. But something was different. She looked lighter somehow. The deep exhaustion that had been etched into her face was gone. She looked like someone who was sleeping at night, someone who could actually enjoy life instead of just surviving it. She glanced up as he entered, and recognition flickered across her face. Her eyes widened slightly and a genuine smile crossed her lips. "It's you," she said, walking toward him. "The man from Christmas Eve. I wondered if I'd ever see you again." Robert smiled back, feeling his nervousness ease. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by for some coffee." "Well, you came to the right place," Katie said warmly. "Have a seat anywhere you'd like." As Robert slid into the same booth where he'd sat that snowy night, he realized that whatever happened next, he was glad he'd come back. Glad he'd taken the chance. Sometimes the most important moments in life came from simply showing up and being honest about who you are and what you need. And what Robert needed, he was realizing, was to connect with someone real. Someone like Katie, who understood loss and love and sacrifice in ways he was still trying to learn. Over the next few months, Robert became a regular at Betty's diner. He'd stop by once or twice a week, always on days when he knew Katie would be working. They'd talk during her breaks, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour when the diner was slow. Their conversations flowed easily, naturally, covering everything from books to music to the small frustrations of daily life. Katie never asked what Robert did for a living, and he never volunteered the information. To her, he was just a friendly customer who seemed interested in hearing about her day. She'd tell him about the art classes she was taking online, showing him sketches on her phone. She'd talk about the kids at the hospital, how one little boy had finally finished a painting he'd been working on for weeks. She'd share small victories like finally getting her apartment's heating to work properly. And Robert would listen, genuinely listen, in a way he'd forgotten how to do. He wasn't thinking about his next meeting or checking his phone every few minutes. He was present, engaged, interested in her stories, not because of what he'd done for her behind the scenes, but because he genuinely enjoyed her company. For his part, Robert began to open up too. He told Katie about his own life, though he downplayed the extent of his wealth. He talked about his children who felt like strangers, his late wife who he'd taken for granted, the success that had somehow left him feeling empty. He confessed to feeling lost despite having everything society said should make him happy. Katie listened without judgment. She never seemed impressed or put off by his admissions. She just nodded, and sometimes offered simple observations that hit harder than any advice from expensive therapists ever had. "Maybe you were looking for happiness in the wrong places," she said once, stirring her tea. "My sister used to say that happiness isn't something you find by searching for it. It's something that shows up when you're busy caring about other people." Those words stayed with Robert for days. Beth, a 16-year-old girl facing death, had understood something he was still struggling to grasp at 58. By October, their friendship had deepened. Robert found himself telling Katie things he'd never told anyone. About his fear of dying alone despite his wealth. About his regret over prioritizing work over family for so many years. About how that one conversation with her on Christmas Eve had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. Katie shared her own struggles too. She talked about survivor's guilt, about the anger she sometimes felt at God or the universe for taking Beth so young. She admitted that the volunteer work she did at the hospital was partly for the kids but mostly for herself, a way to feel close to her sister, to make sense of a senseless loss. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if things had been different," she said one evening. They were sitting in the diner after closing, a habit they'd fallen into. "If my parents hadn't died, if Beth hadn't gotten sick, if I'd gone to art school like I'd planned. But then I feel guilty for even thinking that way, like I'm wishing away the time I had with Beth." "You can miss what you lost without regretting what you had," Robert said gently. "Those two things can exist together." Katie looked at him with tears in her eyes. "How did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise," Robert said. "I'm just old and finally starting to figure things out." They laughed together, and Robert realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed with such genuine ease. This friendship, this unexpected connection with a young woman he'd met by chance had become one of the most important relationships in his life. But the weight of his secret was growing heavier. Every time Katie mentioned some positive change in her life, every time she expressed wonder at her good fortune, Robert felt the guilt gnawing at him. She deserved to know the truth, but he was terrified that telling her would ruin everything. One November evening, Katie was particularly excited. She'd received an email that day informing her she'd been accepted into a competitive online program at a prestigious art school, full scholarship starting in January. "I still can't believe all the good things that have happened this year," she said, her eyes shining. "The debt forgiveness, the apartment repairs, the scholarships, even that beautiful portrait of Beth. It's like someone's been watching over me, you know? Like Beth's up there pulling strings somehow." Robert felt his chest tighten. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. He couldn't let her continue believing in guardian angels and coincidence when the truth was sitting right across from her. "Katie," he said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you." She must have heard something in his tone because her smile faded. "What is it? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I haven't been completely honest with you." Robert took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Do you remember that night we met? Christmas Eve, when I asked what you wanted for Christmas?" "Of course. That was the night I told you about Beth. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about your story, about everything you'd been through. So I did something that you might not like." He paused, watching her face carefully. "I looked into your situation. I found out about your debt, your living conditions, your lost opportunities, and I decided to help." Katie's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization. "What do you mean you helped?" "The debt forgiveness program. The apartment repairs. The scholarships. The portrait of Beth, all of it. I arranged all of it." Robert spoke quickly now, wanting to get it all out. "I created the medical debt program and made sure you qualified. I funded the housing organization that fixed your building. I established the scholarship in Beth's name. I commissioned that portrait. All of it was me." Katie stared at him, her face pale. For a long moment she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. "I don't understand," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that?" "Who are you?" "My name is Robert Hartford. I'm the CEO of Hartford Technologies. I'm wealthy, Katie, very wealthy. And that night in the diner, your story broke something open in me. I wanted to help, but I also didn't want you to feel like charity or lose your dignity, so I tried to do it anonymously. You're Robert Hartford." Katie said it like she was testing the words, trying to make them make sense. "The tech billionaire. You've been coming here for months, talking to me, being my friend, and you never mentioned that you're one of the richest men in the country? I didn't want it to matter." Katie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Didn't want it to matter? You changed my entire life without my knowledge or permission. You manipulated situations, pulled strings, basically played God with my circumstances, and you didn't think I should know about it? I was trying to help. You were trying to make yourself feel better." Katie's voice rose, and Robert saw real anger in her eyes for the first time. "You felt bad after hearing my sad story, so you threw some money at the problem. Do you know how that makes me feel? Like a charity case? Like a project. Like someone so pathetic that a billionaire had to swoop in and fix my life because I couldn't do it myself." "That's not what this was," Robert said, standing too. "Katie, please, you have to understand. I wasn't trying to make you feel bad. I just wanted to help someone who deserved it. Someone who'd been through hell and still showed up every day with kindness and courage. But you lied to me." Her voice broke. "For months, you've been sitting here listening to me talk about all the